If you've been on any Metroid forums recently, you've probably noticed that Other M hasn't been received well by a significant portion of the Metroid fanbase. Common complaints are the linearity and consequently lack of exploration, the quality of the story and cutscenes, and the way that Samus has been characterized. This has led to many statements about the quality of Other M. I've seen huge numbers of people state that it's not only a bad game, but terrible. Others have attacked the director and co-creator of Metroid, Yoshio Sakamoto, for this new direction for the series. So before beginning this review, I'd like to state, by no means is Metroid Other M a bad game. In fact, it's quite good. Is it a good Metroid game though? Well, obviously that's going to depend on your own conception of what a Metroid game is. So with all that out of the way, let's get into it. Metroid Other M takes place a few months after Super Metroid, attempting to fill the time gap between Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. Whilst travelling in her spaceship, she receives a distress signal coming from the Galactic Federation research vessel that you'll come to know as a bottle ship. After landing, Samus encounters her old commander, Adam Malkovich, along with some of her old friends from the Galactic Federation. Eventually, Adam requests Samus' help in uncovering what happened to the bottle ship, and you then begin the game proper. The first hour of the game is very heavy on story. There's a lot of cutscenes and heavily scripted events. After that though, the story is spread quite sparsely across the game's 8 to 10 hour length. Now as I mentioned before, the story is a major point of contention for Metroid fans. It's important to remember that this isn't the first Metroid game to introduce story and cutscenes. The Prime games, Metroid Fusion, and Zero Mission all incorporated some degree of narrative into their games. However, generally the storyline was subtle. It wove itself into the gameplay and never really interfered with the player's experience. The exact opposite is true for Other M. The story is told exclusively through cutscenes and monologues. Now for the most part, the former isn't too bad. There are nice animations and camera angles used, and the characters convey everything with body language quite well. However, there is always one of Samus' monologues running over the top. I'm not exaggerating when I say that these monologues often ruin what are otherwise great scenes. Most of the time she's just describing what you can already see on the screen, or regurgitating what you've just heard. And this is always done using the greatest number of words possible. Just terrible storytelling. It doesn't help that Samus' voice sounds monotone and bored for a greater part of the game, and particularly in the monologues. Show, don't tell, is a lesson that the developers of Other M need to learn. The ending particularly was terrible in my opinion. Without spoiling anything, the game tries to lump a huge amount of characterization and emotional relationships between two new characters, one of which you've only just encountered, from the player in the space of 10 minutes and expects them to care. And quite simply, you don't. The plot loses its focus on Samus entirely, until about the last 30 seconds or so, and is quite possibly the most unsatisfying ending I've ever seen in a game. To briefly touch on the characterization of Samus, I'll just say that she comes off as a fairly weak and insecure person overall. It's pretty rare that she stands up to Adam or anyone else, even though past evidence states that she hates being ordered around. Just look at the intro to Metroid Fusion. In the early stages of the game, she's a bit obsessed with the baby Metroid. In the intro, the tutorial, and the next couple of cutscenes, she's just moping about the death of the baby. Maybe it's because the relationship is told entirely through the terrible monologues, or maybe it's because I've just played the old games, so I've already seen that relationship occur. But it just comes off to me as hollow and annoying. I think Sakamoto was trying to show a maternal side of Samus' character, but just pushed the issue too much and went about it in the wrong way. Now, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the very first trailer for Other M. Ridley's in the game! One thing that was a bit odd, however, was how Samus, upon seeing Ridley, completely loses it. She starts trembling and screaming whilst Ridley growls and attacks her. Now, whilst it makes sense that Samus would have some post-traumatic stress issues with Ridley, she's killed him 6 times already. I'm pretty sure she got over it many, many games ago. There are some redeeming points for Samus' character in the game, though, the most prominent being in Sector Zero. Whilst I wouldn't say the damage is irreparable, the narrative has certainly taken its toll on one of the most iconic and beloved heroines in gaming. This is the area where Metroid Other M shines brightest. The game is played using only one Wii remote. The default position has you holding the remote horizontally and playing the game in a sort of 2.5D third person. You use 2 to jump, 1 to fire, the D-pad to move, the A button for morph ball, etc. It's similar to using a NES controller. However, if a player twists through a remote to face the screen, like if you were playing Metroid Prime 3 for example, the game shifts into first-person mode, where they can look around and lock onto things by holding B, and fire the arm cannon and use missiles with A, although you cannot actually move. Missiles are exclusively used in first-person mode, so you use it quite regularly. Additionally, if the player holds the Wii Remote vertically and holds A, they can use a new move called Concentration, which recharges their missiles and, if near death, health. That's right, there are no health or missile pickups in Other M. The player can recharge by using Concentration and through save stations, and that's it. Whilst this last point may confront some players, the game plays quite smoothly, and it's amazing how much Team Ninja achieved with just one Wii Remote. It's a control scheme that could only really be done on the Wii, so it's nice to see developers taking advantage of that, as well as taking some inspiration from the Prime games. There are only two issues I have with the controls. Firstly, in first-person mode, lock on and look around are mapped to the same button, which can lead to some frustrations, as the lock-on feature is very sticky. Secondly, ledge grabbing and jumping just never seem to work particularly well for me. Oftentimes, Samus would just jump and hit the ledge and fall, rather than grabbing it like she's supposed to. I don't know why this is, but it definitely proved annoying in my playthrough. Team Ninja is the force behind the more recent Ninja Gaiden games, and so, playing to their strengths, Other M is a far more action-oriented game than any of the series' predecessors. Combat is fast and sometimes even brutal. The third-person mode of the game uses an auto-targeting system. Simply point Samus in the general direction and she'll shoot at the nearest target. This works well most of the time, but I have encountered hiccups where Samus aims at nothing or the least relevant enemy, and these were usually at the absolute worst of times. I think some sort of system which gives more precedence to particularly dangerous foes or damageable body parts would improve auto-aiming. Still, no automatic system can be perfect, so they did a pretty good job. Samus now also has more physical abilities. The Sense Move, Lethal Strike, and Overblast are all new techniques which add a more action-oriented feel to the gameplay. Sense Move allows Samus to dodge enemy attacks by pressing in any direction on the D-pad the moment before an enemy's attack hits. Additionally, if you successfully Sense Move while holding 1 to charge your beam, it will instantly charge up to max. This ability is vital to staying alive in Other M, and also contributes significantly to damage output. Sometimes, after significantly damaging an enemy or boss, Samus can perform a Lethal Strike, a powerful finishing move where Samus gets up close and personal with her enemies before, for example, stamping on their head and blasting them with your charge beam, or roundhouse kicking them into their allies. There is a unique animation for every type of enemy, and they add a nice cinematic flair to combat. Similar to the Lethal Strike, you have the Overblast. This allows Samus to jump on certain enemies, such as hoppers, charge up her arm cannon, and fire straight down into her enemy's head. What's interesting to know about the Overblast is that it's not just a cutscene. A player has to charge up the beam and time exactly when to fire it. If they get this timing wrong, they'll be knocked off and suffer some light damage, adding a slight element of risk and reward. One more aspect I'd like to mention is something that I haven't really seen mentioned anywhere else, and that is QuickTime events. However, these aren't the QuickTime events which are obviously about to happen, and have you follow button prompts as they appear on screen. No, Other M makes use of QuickTime event by thrusting them suddenly on the player and letting them use the mechanics of the normal gameplay to escape them. For example, there's a sequence where you enter a room and are suddenly attacked at a high speed from above. What do? You use your Sense Move, just like you normally would. It gets the player to think on their feet and allows the mechanics of the game to be used in a more cinematic way, which I think is a great attempt to try something new with the now stale QuickTime events. All of Samus's traditional weapons from Super Metroid are in the game, and function exactly as they used to, although they nerf the space jump and reduce the gravity suit to a purple hue. I'm sad to say that there is only one new power-up in the game, and it's one of the first you receive, the Diffusion Beam. Whilst it's a great addition to Samus's arsenal, surely some new power-ups could have been added. After all, most of the current weapons have been around since 1986. On that note, actually many of the basic enemies are recycled from Super Metroid, so if you're a long-time fan of the series, then you'll certainly be seeing a lot of old content. With regards to enemies, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, as this is the first time many of the creatures have appeared in 3D, but I don't think the developers could get away with it again. Progression is generally quite linear. You save at a save station and a marker gets placed on your map telling you where to go. On this note, I think it would be nice to have a bit more detail in the maps. I think the prime method of fully three-dimensional rotating maps, as well as room names, should have reappeared in Other M, as it added a certain layer of authenticity to the location and also served as a handy navigational tool. But anyway, whilst I never felt like I was running down a straight corridor due to the aesthetics and intricate design and objectives of certain rooms, freedom was undoubtedly limited. Nevertheless, exploration does still exist in Metroid Other M, but it's far more limited than in past iterations. There are 5 types of items to cover: missile tanks, which now only give you 1 extra missile apiece; energy tanks; energy parts, 4 of which make a whole tank; e-recovery tanks, which increase the amount of health you restore through concentration; and finally Excel charges, which increases how fast your beam charges up. Admittedly, some of these are quite well hidden, and puzzles sometimes make excellent use of your abilities, particularly the Speed Booster and Shine Spark combo. However, many are pretty obvious, particularly as the game marks items on your map after you clear each room of enemies. It's worth noting that only 71% of items can be gained in the first run. You must wait until the credits have rolled before being allowed to access everything else. This post-game section is actually quite enjoyable, particularly the extra boss and final sequence, and harks back to the more traditional aspects of exploration and item collection in Metroid. There are moments in the game when summons will suddenly stop, go into first-person mode, and the player will basically have to play Where's Wally, or Waldo for the Americans, and try to find what is a completely unspecified object. I appreciate the attempt at adding more interactivity to the story and cutscenes, but these are stupid and dull objectives better left to the cutscenes. The one last aspect of gameplay I want to discuss is boss fights. They are one of the best and most varied parts of the game, and consist of some truly awesome moments. To give general examples, there's a boss that controls gravity and can make you weigh a ton, or a boss with whom you need to pull onto land via a tug-of-war using a grappling beam. There is a nice mixture of old and new enemies to fight, and even the old foes have changed, both aesthetically and in terms of their abilities. Whilst Other M is never really hard, the boss fights are the biggest challenges the game has to offer. They stand out from basic enemies just like they should. Actually, trying to avoid spoilers, there's a particular boss who, after you do enough damage, eats you and begins to damage you rapidly, and you have to kill it with a power bomb. The problem is, until this time, the power bomb hasn't been authorized, and you're not told that you can actually use it. I had to check on a walkthrough before I could figure out what to do. So I think having a little cutscene or something there might be a good idea.